Judge Marcus Thorne thought he was untouchable. For 17 years inside courtroom 14B, his gavel wasn't a symbol of justice but a scepter for casual cruelty. When an elderly black man rose to object to a sentencing, Thorne didn't ask for a name. He asked the bailiff if he smelled mothballs before ordering the man's arrest with a flick of his wrist. The gallery laughed, obedient as always. But as the old man was led away in handcuffs, he placed a worn leather folder on the defense table. Inside was a quiet apocalypse, meticulous records of 30 cases where the judge had tampered with verdicts, coerced pleas, or sold his gavel to the highest bidder. Thorne's entire career was about to end, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a clasp no one in that courtroom would ever forget. His name was Albert Crane, a retired legal clerk who had spent 17 years watching Judge Thorne destroy lives from a seat in the back row. No one listened when he tried to speak up, so he started writing everything down. The question no one in the justice system could answer was simple. How do you prosecute a judge who believes his gavel places him above the law? Albert Crane had found a way. And it all started with a case that should have been nothing more than a speeding ticket. It began with a 19-year-old kid named Terrence Little, pulled over in March of 2003 for a broken taillight in a part of town where broken taillights got you handcuffed before they got you a ticket. The officer found a single joint in the glove compartment. First offense. The prosecutor recommended probation and a fine. Judge Thorne didn't even glance at the pre-sentence report. He sentenced Terrence Little to 3 years in a state correctional facility known for breaking young men in half, then leaned back in his chair and asked the bailiff if anyone had seen his 4 o'clock tea time. Albert Crane was sitting in the back row typing up the court log and he froze. He had seen the same prosecutor, the same public defender, the same defendant profile, and the same inexplicably harsh sentence 12 times that year. Always black defendants, always maximum time. Always the same knowing glance between the judge and a particular defense attorney who seemed to lose a lot of cases but never seemed to lose his license. Crane had spent 31 years as a clerk in the county courthouse. He knew the rhythm of a fair trial the way a conductor knows a symphony played in tune. Courtroom 14B was off-key and getting worse. He started keeping a separate notebook in the bottom drawer of his desk at home, a leather-bound ledger he had bought at a stationery store on Howard Street in 1992. His wife Alina had teased him about it back then. "You and your ledgers, Albert. You're going to document your way into heaven." Alina had died of ovarian cancer in 1999, and Crane had not thrown away a single thing she had ever touched. The ledger stayed. He began filling it with docket numbers, timestamps, and the exact language Judge Thorne used when he dismissed evidence that should have exonerated a defendant or admitted testimony that should never have reached a jury. By 2006, Crane had documented 11 cases. He wrote a formal complaint to the State Judicial Ethics Commission and mailed it with copies of his records. 3 months later, he received a 2-sentence reply: insufficient evidence. By 2011, he had 22 cases and a second complaint dismissed without a hearing. By 2017, he had seen a young mother sentenced to 18 months for stealing $70 worth of groceries, while a real estate developer who had defrauded elderly homeowners out of their life savings walked free with a stern warning. Crane watched from the back row as the developer shook hands with the judge's clerk and laughed at something they both found amusing. That night he opened the ledger and wrote in the margin, "The gavel has a price." He retired in 2018 at 68 years old. His pension was modest. His apartment smelled like old paper and the lemon polish Alina had used on the furniture 30 years ago, and he still hadn't found a reason to stop using. He could have let it go. His knees hurt. His sleep was poor. The world had moved on. The folder, now a thick leather case with 30 cases fully detailed, sat on his kitchen table every morning and asked him the same question. If not you, then who? If not now, then when? On the morning of October 4th, 2023, Albert Crane put on his best suit, the gray one with the vest Alina had helped him pick out for their 30th anniversary dinner, and took the number 7 bus to the county courthouse. He walked into courtroom 14B and sat in the back row. A young black man named David Mosley was being sentenced for possession with intent. It was his first conviction. The prosecutor had offered a plea for 18 months, which was already harsh. But Judge Thorne looked at the defendant, then at the clock, then at the prosecutor. "I'm going to make this simple," he said. 10 years, no parole. Next case. And that's when Albert Crane rose from his seat. His voice was thin, but it carried. "Your Honor, I have 30 cases sitting in this folder that prove you have been selling your rulings for nearly 2 decades. The courtroom went deathly still. Judge Thorne looked up. He removed his glasses. He smiled. And then he said something that made the gallery laugh and sealed his own fate. "Arrest that old man," Thorne said, waving a hand as if dismissing a waiter who had brought the wrong drink. "Contempt, trespassing, whatever fits. Let him cool off in a cell and remember where he doesn't belong." The gallery laughed, the quick, reflexive laughter of people who had learned that the safest place in courtroom 14B was inside the judge's favor. Albert Crane did not flinch. He did not look at the bailiff who was already moving toward him with handcuffs. Instead, he set the worn leather folder on the defense table, his fingers resting on it for one deliberate second. Then he turned and let them take him. The only sound as he walked out was the soft scuff of his polished shoes on linoleum and the click of handcuffs closing. Janelle Okonkwo, the public defender who had been standing beside David Mosley moments earlier, did not move. She was 28 years old, 2 years out of law school, and she had just watched an elderly man sacrifice himself to place something on her table. She stepped forward and picked up the folder. The tab read, "Thorne Cases, 2003-2023. She opened it. The first page was a typed summary of the Terrence Little case, complete with the prosecutor's original probation recommendation, the transcript of Thorne's tea-time remark, and a note in Crane's elegant script. First one I knew for certain. She turned to page 2, then page 5, then page 11. By the time she reached the end, she was sitting on the floor of her windowless office with the door locked, her hands pressed flat against the pages as if the air itself had grown heavier. This was not a complaint letter that could be dismissed with a form rejection. This was the internal architecture of a 2-decade conspiracy laid out in the precise, unkillable prose of a man who had spent 31 years writing legal records that no one could argue with. Within an hour, she had called her cousin David, an investigator with the State Judicial Ethics Commission. He listened for 10 minutes without interrupting. Then he said, "I've seen complaints on Thorne before. They always die." "What makes this one different?" Janelle told him about the bank records. Crane had somehow obtained copies of 3 separate wire transfers, totaling just under $90,000, from a shell company connected to Michael Reyes, the defense attorney who had appeared in 22 of the 30 cases in the folder. Each transfer had been made within 48 hours of a favorable ruling. The payment for the Terrence Little sentence was the smallest, $3,000 for a kid's life. David was quiet for a long moment. "Get me that folder, now, before Thorne's people realize what's missing." But Thorne's people already knew. The clerk who had seen Crane leave the folder had called the judge's chambers before Janelle had even left the courtroom. By noon, a private investigator with a $2,000 retainer from Reyes' firm was sitting in a car across from the public defender's office, watching Janelle walk out with the folder tucked inside her coat. She didn't notice him, but she noticed the unmarked sedan that followed her to the Ethics Commission building. She took a detour through a parking garage, lost the tail, and made the handoff to David in a stairwell that smelled like old cigarettes and disinfectant. David opened the folder on his desk at 6 o'clock that evening. He read for 4 hours. He called his supervisor at 10:30 and said 2 words, "It's real." The commission had buried 2 previous complaints against Thorne because the lead investigator at the time, a woman named Patricia Hogan, had been pressured by the Chief Justice's office to protect the court's reputation. Patricia had retired in 2021, but David found her phone number in an old personnel file and called her anyway. She answered on the 3rd ring. "I've been waiting for this call," she said. "There's something I didn't put in the file." She told him about a sealed audio recording she had made during a meeting with Michael Reyes in 2017. in which Reyes had explicitly described how he and Thorne arranged plea deals that maximized sentences for black defendants while minimizing consequences for paying clients. She had buried the recording because Reyes had threatened her granddaughter. "I kept a copy," she said. "It's in a safety deposit box at First Maryland Trust. The key is under a loose floorboard in my guest bedroom." By the following morning, David had the recording. The sound quality was poor, someone coughing in the background, a door slamming, but the words were unmistakable. Reyes' voice. "Thorne knows how to handle the ones who don't pay. You don't worry about that." And then quieter but clear as a bell. 3,000 for a possession case, 10 for a felony, and he takes care of the sentencing. It's clean. It's been clean for 15 years. That recording was the first thing the Ethics Commission played at its emergency hearing 2 days later. The second thing was Albert Crane, released from custody after the contempt charge mysteriously evaporated under media pressure, testifying in a calm, steady voice about every single case in the folder. The third thing was a grainy cell phone video that a courthouse intern had shot 6 months earlier, showing Judge Thorne walking into a steakhouse with Michael Reyes and emerging 2 hours later with a bottle of wine and a smile. By the end of that hearing, the commission voted 7-0 to start formal disbarment proceedings. But Michael Reyes had spent 20 years building a fortress of favors and fear. He wasn't about to let an old man and a young public defender take it apart without a fight. That night, Janelle's apartment door was kicked in. Janelle wasn't home when the door came down. She was at the hospital, sitting beside a bed in the cardiac unit where Albert Crane had been admitted 3 hours earlier with chest pains that the doctors were calling severe stress, but that Janelle understood as something simpler. A 72-year-old man who had spent 2 decades carrying the weight of 30 stolen verdicts had finally put the folder down, and his body had asked for the bill. She was holding his hand when her phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor. "Someone kicked in your door. Cops are here. Are you okay?" She stared at the screen for a long moment, then looked at Crane's sleeping face, the oxygen tube, the monitor beeping its slow, steady rhythm. She did not call her neighbor back. She called David at the Ethics Commission and said 3 words, "They're not stopping." David was quiet for a beat. Then, "Neither are we." The break-in was clumsy, almost performative. Nothing was taken. The folder was already at the commission's secure evidence room, locked behind 2 keycard doors and a safe that required simultaneous biometric confirmation from 2 senior investigators. Whoever kicked in Janelle's door wasn't trying to retrieve anything. They were sending a message. "We know where you live, we know you're alone, and we can reach you whenever we want." The police took a report and told her to stay somewhere else for a few days. She packed a bag and moved into David's guest room without a word. That night she sat at his kitchen table and opened her laptop. There was an email waiting from an anonymous address with the subject line. Crane wasn't the only one. The email contained a single attachment, a scanned document from 1994, the year before Thorne was appointed to the bench. It was a settlement agreement between Michael Reyes and a former client who had accused Reyes of bribing a different judge, a Judge Harold Whitfield, in a custody dispute. The client had accepted $15,000 in exchange for silence. The case had never reached the Ethics Commission. The judge had never been investigated. He had retired in 2002 with full pension and a commendation from the state bar. Whitfield, the email said, had mentored Thorne. They had played golf every Thursday for 12 years. This wasn't one corrupt judge. This was a pipeline. Janelle and David spent the next 3 days working 18-hour shifts, chasing the new thread. They subpoenaed Whitfield's old financial records, which took a court order and 2 angry calls from the state attorney general's office. When the records arrived, they found the same pattern. Shell company, same bank, same tight window between payments and rulings. But there was more. The Shell Company, a consulting firm called Apex Strategic Solutions, had been incorporated in 1989 and had made payments to at least 4 other judges across the county over a 35-year period. The total amount, adjusted for inflation, exceeded $4 million. The oldest payment on record was from the same year Thorne graduated law school. The man who had incorporated Apex was not Michael Reyes. It was Harold Whitfield. Janelle stared at the incorporation papers until the words blurred. She had started with one judge and a leather folder. Now she was looking at a system that had been embedding itself in the local judiciary since before she was born. And Reyes, the man everyone assumed was the mastermind, was just the middleman. The real architect had been sitting on a golf course collecting commendations, while young black men and women were sentenced to decades for crimes that paying clients walked away from with fines and sealed records. The story broke on a Thursday morning in the Baltimore Banner, thanks to a reporter named Sasha Kim who had been tipped off by someone inside the commission. The headline read, "Retired Judge Named as Architect of Decades-Long Courtroom Bribery Scheme." By noon, the story had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By evening, Harold Whitfield's house in a gated community in Howard County had a news van parked outside and a man in his late 70s refusing to open the door while his lawyer issued statements about baseless allegations and political witch hunts. But the documents were real. The signatures matched. The bank had confirmed the transfers. Whitfield's denials were the kind of noise that guilty men make when they realize the evidence is no longer in their control. And then it got worse. The anonymous email address sent a second message, this time with a spreadsheet attached. It was a list of every defendant who had appeared before Thorne or Whitfield and received a sentence above the state guidelines while represented by a public defender. 247 names. Each one with a case number, a sentence length, and a 3-letter code that Janelle didn't recognize until David pulled the commission's internal disciplinary files and cross-referenced them. The code stood for the reason the sentence had been upheld on appeal: judicial discretion. Every single one of those 247 people had tried to challenge their sentence and failed, because the system was designed to defer to the very judges who had sold them. Janelle printed the list and taped it to the wall of David's office, a cascade of names that stretched from floor to ceiling. She stood in front of it for a long time, her arms crossed, her jaw set. Then she turned to David. "We need to find every single one of them. The living ones need to know what was done to them, and they need to testify." But the hearing was in 3 weeks, and Michael Reyes had not been arrested. He had been questioned briefly by federal investigators who lacked enough to indict. He had lawyered up with a firm that specialized in defending white-collar criminals, and he was walking around free, attending charity galas, smiling for cameras. His strategy was simple: discredit the investigation, frame it as a personal vendetta by a disgruntled old clerk and a young public defender with a political agenda. He gave an interview to a local TV station in which he described Albert Crane as a lonely widower with a persecution complex, and Janelle Okonkwo as an activist who had never won a case in a real courtroom. He said the ledgers were forgeries, the recording was doctored, and the whole thing was an orchestrated attempt to steal money from his firm. He smiled through all of it, the practiced, easy smile of a man who had spent 20 years learning that the system would always protect him. 4 days before the disbarment hearing, Albert Crane suffered a second heart attack. Janelle was at his bedside when he woke up. His voice was a thread. "Did we finish it?" he asked. She told him about Whitfield, about the 247 names, about the hearing that would either strip Thorne of his license or let him walk free. Crane listened without moving. Then he reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't let them make you small," he said, "the way they make all of us small." He closed his eyes. Janelle stayed until the nurses asked her to leave. When she stepped into the hallway, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Whitfield's house. Tonight. Come alone. Bring a recorder." She stared at it for a full minute. Then she called David. "I know who's been sending the emails," she said, "and I think she's finally ready to talk." The text was from a woman named Evelyn Whitfield, the retired judge's daughter, who had spent 40 years watching her father pass a collection plate at church, while he hid the evidence of a $4 million bribery ring in a locked filing cabinet in his home office. She had found the cabinet key 3 years ago, after her mother died and her father began spending more time on the golf course and less time pretending to be the man his congregation believed him to be. She had read every document. She had photographed every page. And she had waited, through 2 years of therapy, through a contentious family argument that ended with her father calling her ungrateful, through the slow realization that the man who had taught her to ride a bike had also sold the freedom of hundreds of people whose names he never bothered to learn. Now, at 11 o'clock at night, she opened the front door of the Whitfield house and handed Janelle a USB drive containing every photograph, every financial record, and a recorded conversation in which her father had casually described the consulting arrangement with Michael Reyes as just the cost of doing business in a town that doesn't like to share power. The disbarment hearing opened on a Tuesday morning in a conference room at the State Judicial Center. Judge Marcus Thorne arrived in a $3,000 suit with a lawyer who charged $1,500 an hour and a smile that suggested he had already moved on from this inconvenience. The smile lasted exactly 14 minutes. That was how long it took for David to play the audio recording of Michael Reyes describing the payment structure, followed by Evelyn Whitfield's sworn testimony about her father's involvement, followed by the bank records that showed the money moving from Apex Strategic Solutions into accounts controlled by Thorne's brother-in-law. When the commission chair asked Thorne if he wished to respond, the judge leaned into his microphone with the same casual cruelty that had defined his 20 years on the bench, and said, "This entire proceeding is a political theater manufactured by an old man with a grudge and a public defender who couldn't argue her way out of a parking ticket." That was when Janelle stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She simply placed Albert Crane's leather folder on the commission's table and opened it to the first page. 247 people, she said. 247 sentences that exceeded state guidelines. 247 lives that were altered or ended by a man who treated his gavel like a cash register. And all of it is in here, Your Honor, in the handwriting of a 72-year-old widower who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. You can dismiss me. You can dismiss him, but you cannot dismiss 30 cases with matching bank records, 10 corroborating witnesses, and a confession from the judge's own co-conspirator's daughter. So with respect, sir, what exactly are you waiting for? The room went silent in the way rooms go silent when the air has shifted and everyone knows it. The commission chair looked at Thorne, then at the folder, then at the ceiling. He removed his glasses. "The commission will recess for deliberation," he said. "We will return in 30 minutes. They returned in 11. The vote was unanimous. Disbarment, effective immediately. Referral to the State Attorney General for criminal prosecution on 30 counts of judicial misconduct, bribery, and conspiracy." The chair asked Thorne to surrender his gavel, a ceremonial gesture that had no legal weight but which the commission had quietly agreed upon the night before as a symbolic acknowledgement of what had been stolen. Thorne refused. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the room without looking at anyone. But when he reached the hallway, 2 federal agents were waiting with an arrest warrant. The gavel was removed from his chambers by court security later that evening and placed in an evidence box. The clerk who packed it away later said it felt heavier than it should have. Harold Whitfield was arrested the same day at his home in Howard County. His daughter stood on the front lawn and watched them lead him out in handcuffs. He did not look at her. He did not say a word. Michael Reyes was taken into custody 48 hours later at his firm's offices, where he had been shredding documents in a panic that suggested he had finally realized the system he had spent 2 decades gaming was no longer his to control. The federal indictment named all 3 men and outlined a conspiracy that had touched every corner of the county judicial system for a generation. The Baltimore Banner called it the most significant judicial corruption case in state history. The Attorney General's office promised a full review of every case Thorne and Whitfield had ever presided over. Albert Crane watched the news coverage from his hospital bed, a small television mounted to the wall that the nurses had angled so he could see without straining. Janelle sat beside him, holding the leather folder on her lap. He was too weak to speak much, but when the broadcast showed Thorne being led out of the courthouse in handcuffs, Crane turned his head toward the screen and let out a breath he had been holding for 17 years. "Eleanor," he whispered. "I finished it." Janelle opened the folder and found, tucked into the back pocket, a sealed envelope addressed to his late wife. She asked him if he wanted her to read it. He shook his head. "It's just a receipt," he said, his voice cracking, "for the stationery store. The day we bought the ledger, I told her I'd use it for something that mattered." He closed his eyes. Janelle slipped the envelope back into the folder and did not let go of it again. 2 weeks later, the state announced a special commission to review all 247 cases. Terrence Little, whose 3-year sentence for a single joint had started this chain of events, was released after serving 11 years. He was 30 years old. He had lost his 20s to a judge's tea time. When a reporter asked him how he felt, he said, "I'm not angry, I'm tired, but I'm grateful to the man with the folder." David Mosley, the young man whose sentencing had prompted Crane to stand up, had his sentence commuted and was reunited with his mother at a church in East Baltimore, where the choir sang "Amazing Grace," and the pastor thanked God for a quiet old man who had refused to mind his own business. Janelle Okonkwo was offered a position at the State Ethics Commission. She turned it down. Instead, she opened a nonprofit legal clinic in the same neighborhood where Terrence Little had been pulled over 20 years earlier. The clinic specialized in post-conviction relief for defendants who had been sentenced by corrupt judges. She kept the leather folder in a glass display case in the lobby, next to a photograph of Albert Crane taken on the day he was released from custody. He was smiling in the photograph, a small, tired smile, the kind worn by people who have carried something a very long way and finally set it down. 1 month after the disbarment, a janitor cleaning out Judge Thorne's old chambers found a handwritten note wedged behind a bookshelf. It was dated October 4th, the day of Crane's arrest. In Thorne's handwriting it read, "The old man has a file. Find it before someone opens it." The note had been written 45 minutes before Crane set the folder on the defense table. Thorne had known. He had known, and he had done nothing, because he couldn't imagine that a retired clerk with a worn leather folder could bring down a system that had been protecting powerful men for 35 years. He was wrong. The quiet click of that folder's clasp, the sound nobody in courtroom 14B would ever forget, turned out to be the sound of a door opening. And once opened, it could not be closed again. Albert Crane never wanted a statue. He just wanted to finish the ledger. The quiet click of that clasp was not just a door opening. It was a question being asked of everyone who heard it. What would you do with a folder full of truth? Most of us spend our lives believing that powerful people don't fall, that the systems built to protect them will always hold. But every once in a while, someone refuses to accept that answer. Someone with no badge, no press pass, no political capital, just a leather folder and the stubborn belief that writing things down still matters. The question is whether corruption exists. It does. The question is who is paying attention and what they're willing to carry and how long they're willing to wait. Drop in the comments the moment you first realized that justice isn't always blind. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you tonight, send it to one person who needs to be reminded that the quietest voice in the room can still bring the whole thing down. If you're not subscribed yet, stay close. There's another story coming next week that I honestly cannot wait to tell you. Until then, may the truth always find its way into the right hands.